might be here for the first time, let me give you a warm welcome to Food Hub. And pretty much we are a theme hub of the SA network, and we examine the nexus between systems thinking and innovation with food, and create a space for learning and applying the theories and ideas of system thinking and system innovation. And we create a space really for various activities, events like this one, and even collaborations. So just want to again give you a warm welcome to our food hub. I shouldn't say it's the best hub in SA network, but probably people say, but for me, it's the best hub in SA network. So I just want to say welcome for being here. And for our members, so I'm Adrian from Switzerland. We have Azra here as well from hitting in from Germany. Jill, she's not here on the call, but she's also one of our core members. Of course, Anya and our honored guest, Valentina. You'll hear a little bit about her a little later on. So as it relates to what you could expect for this time, we're going to pretty much doing now intros and finding out where you are, where you're coming in from. So like Anya asked, if you just please put your name in the chat and what country you're coming in from, that'd be great. After that, we'll move straight into our speaker and the case study, which I'm really excited to hear what they're doing. It's really amazing stuff. And you will get a lot of value from this time spent with her. So really get prepared for that. We will have Q&A after that session, and then just ending off the time together with the outro. So with no further ado, I want to just invite Anya to give a warm welcome to Valentina and give that introduction. Thanks so much.
Yes, and also while you have any questions, you can post them into the chat and we will paste them in the Miro board, or it would be good to paste them in the Miro board itself, so you have the link in the chat for that. And this session is only an hour long, so I'll already start with introducing our amazing guest, Valentina Toledo. Thank you very much for spending time to share with us your project that you've been working on, Growing Our Future, and introducing Valentina a bit more. She's a senior change designer at Form for the Future, originally from Sao Paulo and currently based in London. And I'll pass it on to you, Valentina. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. And hi, everyone. Really excited to be here and to talk to you guys about Growing Our Future. As Anya said, I'm Valentina. I'm a senior change designer, and Form for the Future, if you haven't heard of us before, we're a international sustainability nonprofit. We've been going for about 25 years now, and we've got offices in the UK, in the US, in Southeast Asia, and in India. And we look to catalyze change, deep and urgent and systemic change in what we see and what we call as 3 transition areas. So in food system, in the energy system, and the purpose of business and society. And we do that primarily through 2 different ways. We partner with organizations and help them, with the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead of them in the next, decades that will be disruptive, as we know. And we also convene large multi-stakeholder collaborations that are essentially problems that are too big for one company to solve. And that can be on anything from regenerative agriculture, which we'll talk about a bit today, to cotton, to circularity, to protein, to we've even done one on salmon feed, the food that goes to feed salmon. So many different things. And our approach primarily is a systems change approach and a futures approach. So looking into the future, scenario planning, casting back, as well as some of the systems tools that you probably all have heard of, and we'll talk a little bit more about today. And some of you might know the School of System Change. That is our sister organization and the kind of educational branch of Forum for the Future that's now luckily spinning off into its own organization. So if you haven't heard about the Schools of System Change yet, do also go check it out. And what I'm going to talk about today primarily is the Growing Our Future initiative, which is, as we've got here, on the slide, an initiative that's looking to accelerate the transition to a just and regenerative food system. It runs in the US and has so since 2020. I came on board in 2021, and I currently lead one of the work streams that we'll talk about a little bit later on. And then it also runs in the UK when that launched last year, and I also work on that program. And we're scoping out currently a collaboration that could run in India as well as in mainland Europe. But essentially, it's a multi-stakeholder collaboration. You might know cross-sectoral collaboration, essentially where we bring in actors from across the food system, in this case, to work on the challenge of accelerating our food system to be more just and regenerative. We have a kind of big tent model, and this is one of the, obviously, the design decisions that we had to create. There's different ways that you can create a collaboration, but we use a kind of big tent model where people can kind of come in and out and have different ways of being engaged. They can be more one-to-one and really engage with the work stream. They can stay at the kind of more meta level where we also run the kind of collaboration for people to meet outside of the work stream. So maybe like the SI hub, there's maybe like one big systems innovation hub, and then there's all the little hubs, kind of similar to that. We're not a kind of pay to play model. It's not a membership organization. It's very open as a nonprofit. We've got the funding essentially to focus in on what we think, what we have defined in our theory of change as what we want to deliver on, which is essentially to drive change on how participants act, feel, and collaborate. And so the work really is the kind of messiness of that, how we kind of do that. How do we accelerate the change? And how do we shift the food system? What needs to change, rather than say like really big commitments that everyone signs on to? Like, what does it take to do the work? So we've got kind of really knotty and chewy questions like, how might a diverse community work to collectively catalyze systemic change while holding different perspectives and areas of influence? How might we honor and acknowledge deep historic harms that have shaped the system today? And how can we work collectively toward a new future? How might we build relationships and systems of accountability to allow us to work urgently at scale and prioritize deep systemic transformation? So nice and easy. No mean feats. But like I said, so the US program's been running since 2020, the UK one since 2022. The US one began with a diagnosis of the system. We originally got some funding to do that, just that process in and of itself. And we did that through a participatory co-creative approach to kind of define what were those barriers to scaling regenerative agriculture. The US one now has 4 work streams that are underway, as well as that collaborative space. And in the next slide, there's a little bit about the UK process. So the UK one started later in 2022 off the success of the US one, and it builds on the foundations of the diagnosis of the US, which I'll elaborate on a little bit, and has now selected the work streams that it will take forward. And today, what I'm going to spend most of the time talking about is that kind of diagnosis phase that started off both programs and turned them into work streams, and some of those systems change tools that we use to get there. So we'll talk about things like outlining the goals of the system, the multi-level perspective tool, talk about leverage points, and how we used those to kind of get to a point where we were going to go to action, right? Because we had to have a solid diagnosis that then would lead to kind of really intentional action that was, had a solid foundation of why we chose those, where to put our effort into those work streams. So on the next slide, you'll see this quote that maybe some of you have heard before, that the purpose of a system is what it does. After all, there's no point in claiming that the purpose of a system is to do what it constantly fails to do. So this is why we often talk about the food system isn't broken. The food system delivers exactly what it does, exactly what it was designed to do. And on the next slide, you'll see that that was also one of the starting points of how we articulated the vision that we were kind of working towards. So we say, you know, we wanted to accelerate the transition to a just and regenerative food system. What does that look like? And again, because we have a co-creative participatory approach, it wasn't necessarily for us to define what that was. So through a process with the participants, we articulated on the left the current agricultural system that we have today, you know, that it externalizes environmental impacts, that it maximizes calories with little, you know, eye to nutrition. It's got competitive price reduction for consumers. It maximizes profit in the hands of a few. It's got systemic social inequity built into it, etc. And then we were like, well, what is that? What does the new system deliver on? What are the goals of a new system that we're kind of working towards? What are those outcomes? And you see here, it's more complicated on the right, right? It's not as simple and reductive as the current system is. There is more of that complexity and considerations and externalities that need to be highlighted and made more important than it currently is. So you'll see that it restores those ecosystem services. It regionalizes, localizes, and diversifies equitable production systems. It maximizes nutrient density, and public health rather than, say, maximization of just calories. It reconnects people and food. It creates and distributes value more equitably, fostering accountability. And it builds in, you know, social equity and welfare for all, including, you know, animals. And so from this starting point, so this process in itself took a few workshops, and we took participants, our role as convener was taking participants to the point where we defined this. And the US one had a version of this. The UK one this is the UK version, because people in the collaboration need to feel a kind of sense of autonomy and agency in the work that we're doing. So we built this vision together from which we would kind of continue on. So in the next slide, you know, we also have to think about, how do we know when the system is shifting? So if we're saying we're wanting to move from one system to the next, what are the signs that will tell us that the system itself is shifting? So these are the kind of things on the slide here that we're looking for, and we're kind of building into our approach and also into our grant agreements with funders. These are the kind of things that, you know, when we make explicit to our funders that we're talking about systemic change, and they're like, great, what the hell does that mean? You know, these are the kind of things that we're talking about building into it as well. And this helps us keep an eye onto how and when will we know that the current system is shifting. On the next slide, I'm going to talk about the multi-level perspective. And some of you might know it, some of you might not. But this was one of the kind of systems tools that we really used in this diagnosis phase. So essentially, we have three levels in this tool. We've got the landscape level, which is that big picture, operating context, long-term mega trends that kind of exist in our society, things like policy, consumer behaviors, the economic system, to things like the climate, the environment, these big kind of mega, slower moving things. Then we've got the regime level, which is easy to kind of think of as the mainstream day-to-day business as usual space. This is where it's operating. This is where things are moving quicker. But this is business as usual. And then at the niche, we've got the kind of margins of the mainstream, disruptive technologies, innovators, the niche players that are kind of pushing the boundaries and trying something new, failing forward and moving and progressing, but aren't things that are in the mainstream. So if we go on the next slide, we talk about it as systems change when there's pressure from the landscape and or the innovation from the niche, from the bottom up, kind of come together to disrupt the mainstream. So you need both. You need those at the niche level, innovating, disrupting, but you also need kind of signals from the landscape that help the whole system come together and create a new mainstream, essentially. And this was one of the tools that we can use to kind of understand where things are in the system. So we can map like who's operating at that landscape level, what is happening at that niche level, who are those innovators, you know, in the context of the food system, who are those innovators, those farmers, those disruptors, the technology that is happening, and what is part of the kind of day-to-day business. And then on the next slide, some of you might have heard of leverage points before, but leverage points are, you know, as it says here, essentially small change that can have a big effect on the overall behavior of the system. And that's where kind of the leverage part comes in. And it's strategic points that you can kind of you know, you might have heard acupressure points as well in systems change language, that it's where there's a kind of convergence of barriers, issues, concerns combined with resources, power, energy that can help catalyze that point. So when we're mapping the system, we're also wanting to keep an eye on where are those converging points that leverage, where is there a lot of energy that can shift a system. All that to say that that is how we ended up using it in our process. And in the next slide, some of you might have heard or seen a version of this. This is from Donella Meadows. The leverage points, places to intervene in a system. This is an interpretation of it. But we've got the system here on the left, and those leverage points have different leverage, or interventions in a system can have different leverage. And the further you go along the system, you get to those, you see at the top there, things that get to really the kind of core of the system, the goals of the system, the beliefs, the values that are underpinned it. And then coming all the way to the left from the information, the rules, the power, the feedback loops, to the closer to the system, the metrics, materials, and standards. So according to Donella Meadows, the further along you are on this scale, you have like a higher degree of leverage, but it's also harder to implement. So it's hard to change the goals of the system. It's hard to change values and beliefs. But that's not to say that we don't, that we should only go for the hard and the difficult. We need all points, all kinds of interventions on the system, but this tool helps us kind of understand where our interventions it helps us diagnose where our interventions are essentially on this, right? Are we looking more at changing how the flow of resources goes? Are we looking at changing the rules of the game? Are we really looking at changing the purpose of the system, right? So we often look at this and we ourselves are looking at our interventions and saying, where are we along this track? And it helps to kind of build a map of the kind of interventions that we want to be delivering and ensure that they are systemic and deep. So the next slide shows you the diagnosis that we started with the US Growing Our Future. So you'll see the map, the MLP map on the background, and I'll give you just a quick second to kind of read through some of these and get a feel for what are the barriers essentially to scaling regenerative agriculture. Nice. So we did this through a process, again, participatory, co-creative approach. We took participants in Growing Our Future through this process to define these barriers, and then started mapping them on the MLP. Are they more like the big finance, public health issues? Things like higher yields are the measure of success. Are they in the mainstream, like the use of metrics and data being inconsistent, the lack of land access, market incentives and pricing and economics do not support farmers and farm worker livelihoods? Or are they in the niche, things that farmers usually are experiencing? So the lack of reliable information, the lack of access to funding, etc. So then on the next slide, from those barriers, we defined the leverage points. So exactly what we were just talking about earlier, and there are fewer of them because actually as you know, you might have read, some of the barriers converge into leverage points. And this, and it's kind of also like thinking about it in the flip side of risks and opportunities, right? The flip side of a risk is an opportunity. Leverage points also kind of show an opportunity to address barriers, and can also be plotted against the MLP. So you'll see here, this was the one that we created for Growing Our Future UK. So if there was a lack of kind of public awareness and knowledge about regenerative agriculture, maybe we engage with consumers to increase demand, or that there was, you know, not supportive policy, maybe we shape policy to build resilient agriculture economy system. If the market incentives aren't right, how do we shift those incentives? And so on. So you can see there, I'll give you just a second to glance over some of the ones we defined. So interestingly, one of the things that was surprising, I suppose, especially as someone who works on both the US and the UK one of the design questions we had to do in the UK was, do we start a re-diagnosis from scratch with our UK participants? And actually we found that the map of the barriers and the leverage points for our US diagnosis actually were broadly the same to the experience of regenerative agriculture in the UK. Of course, there are cultural nuances and contextual and bioregional nuances, absolutely. But they provided, that original diagnosis provided a really solid diagnosis that the UK team could then add to and reinterpret and tweak things, obviously, to the context. So this is the UK one, and we added 2 or 3 more that weren't in the original US one, but it's actually been an interesting observation for us that the experience in the US is actually not too dissimilar to the experience in the UK. So that was really helpful for us. So then from these leverage points, which again we created all of these through a series of workshops, taking participants through. We then had to decide, right, what do we do with this? And so again, we used this original diagnosis to then define the areas of work that we were going to take forward. And over the next 4 months, we took participants through a series of workshops that helped us funnel down from these leverage points down into work streams. And because there was a sense of agency and participation from the participants throughout this process, they would feel more buy-in and legitimacy to the work that we created and would want to participate in because they felt a sense of ownership in what we had defined. So the next slide is what we took forward in the US. So the work streams that became the leverage points that became work streams in the US were shape policy to build resilient agriculture economy, financing the transition, which is linked to recognizing and value ecosystem services, because we ended up doing an ecosystem services pilot that was financed really interestingly, and strengthened routes to market. And then in the next slide, you'll just see how they're articulated now. And we have been running these work streams for a few years. And earlier this year, we released a series of toolkits, one for each of the work streams, and they're available. They're hyperlinked on the board, but they're also available on our website, a set of toolkits for each of them. So for financing the transition, we were looking at a cotton ecosystem services pilot in the US. And what were the learnings that we've got from how to run one of these pilots that are essentially looking at a rotation of food and fiber, which we think is going to be really interesting and needed in the future. What's the kind of relationship and rotations between those? policy change. So the Farm Bill in the US is the big, the biggest policy bill in the US. And we brought together both our BIPOC farm communities and our large corporate players and said, how can we, strengthen the asks that each of us have and work together and ensure that equity is kind of built into the policy asks for the Farm Bill. The Pathways to Market workstream, which is the one I lead, which was looking at a new business model for the regenerative marketplace that looks at reimagining how buyers and sellers, the relationship between buyers and sellers. And then social outcomes, which was looking at how regen ag standards and certifications have largely focused on environmental outcomes, rightly so. But what does it mean to deliver on social outcomes? What do those social outcomes look like? And we have also brought our BIPOC farm communities together with the standards and certifications that are affiliated with the program, and look at what does community-centered social outcomes look like. So you can find out more about these on the hyperlink. And then the following one, just really quickly, because we've just got to this point on the next slide, we've got the UK one, which also took the diagnosis and has slightly different work streams. So yes, please. Thank you, Anya. So here we looked at our short list was between looking at engaging consumers to increase demand, looking at infrastructure and kind of logistics, like what needs to change from logistics, distribution, transport, infrastructure to enable regen ag to scale in the UK, looking at kind of coalition building between regen ag farmer pilots, and also strengthening routes to market and what it will mean for, say, middle actors and their role in scaling regen ag in the UK. So finally, I'm sorry, I feel like I've been talking for ages, but really quickly, I wanted to highlight, just before we kind of open the floor to some questions. On the next slide, I've got some thoughts about lessons learned so far in implementing. And I'm, of course, apologies for not giving too much detail about everything. I had to give just a kind of overview contour of some of the things we've done. But definitely collaboration and consultation requires trust, and trust takes time to build. And so that's one of the things we've had to ensure is kind of built into the project throughout. It requires time and dedication. And also when you're bringing together disparate actors who might not have communicated before, and there might be kind of serious injustices that have been kind of committed. So we brought sort of farm communities and indigenous communities in the US with some major US players, multinationals, and there's some hard conversations that need to happen there, right? So we have to be very mindful and thoughtful on how we facilitate and navigate those conversations, and how different people are coming from different places, have different power within the system, but also within their own organizations, and what they're trying to get out of it. And this requires obviously a lot of time to do that mindfully. And then finally, a couple more thoughts on the next slide. If you don't mind, Anya, thank you. We have, we might be skipping one. He's just there on their own. So like I said, throughout, we have an intentional co-creative and participatory approach, which means that we're not telling people what to do. We are a convener and a facilitator to help bring that to the fore. But it builds legitimacy and it builds buy-in to the work that you do. Right now, as you can imagine, COP just around the corner, there's a lot of demand on people's time, and especially when it comes to food transition and transformation, there's a lot of asks about joining collaborations and initiatives and groups, etc. And that requires you to be really intentional about what you're doing and why you're doing it and what the unique value proposition is, because there's just a lot, and expect also to kind of even be turned down in certain contexts because people are really stretched. There's also this about what's the just enough structure of a program that allows for systems, the messiness of systems change and emergence to kind of come out and affect the direction of travel, but also means you kind of aligned on your North Star and you're not being pulled in too many directions. But you kind of have to be able to pivot and, relay expectations to both funders and participants on, where you're going to go. And that can be frustrating sometimes for people where they're like, just tell me what you're going to do. And we're like, well, it depends what happens and what people say. So it's something to be mindful of as well. And finally, as forum and through these processes, we ourselves play different roles, right? We move from, say, convening these conversations to then implementing the work through work streams. Those are different skills, and the former might allow you to remain neutral and might need you to be a neutral party, but the latter, when you're talking about delivering work, requires you to take a kind of point of view and a position. And again, that's just building that awareness and knowing that your role might change and that's okay. But if you're expecting it and your stakeholders know it, that's better for everyone else. How did I do on time, Anya? Did I go way over?
No, perfect.
Excellent. Cool. Well, I'm done presenting. I don't know. I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat, or the board. But
So,
are you? Yeah,
yeah, hey, Valentina. So I think there are two questions, and I actually really loved how the whole system, I mean, you in this project have let the system evolve for itself, and how individual ecosystems are independently evolving and waiting for the project to sort of take its own time to evolve and see how it can actually cause a different leverage points to make a difference that we would like to see. Well, I really liked one question that I have. I wanted to find out how would you get different stakeholders, like from different ends of the chain, like the farmers and the consumers, to interact with you, and whether any specific challenges concerned with just farmers or just consumers to get them to see the idea of regenerative agriculture and then for them to have to contribute to this system.
Yeah, so there's definitely something in, I would say, from our experience, that the being a nonprofit helps, right? Because there's a legitimacy in that space as well. But also that we, and this is to form for the future specifically, as a neutral convener, we kind of are clear that this is a space of respect and a facilitated space that will pull forward that all perspectives are heard, that we're centering justice and equity, and we're centering regenerative principles, and we are holding everyone to account to that level. Is crucial, because that means that we build trust both from the kind of farmer perspective, and obviously knowing the language and the struggles that, say, farmers specifically are going through helps, and you can build that trust. But we also have a lot of relationships with, say, corporate partners who know us and know, that we are wanting to help raise their ambition, but also wanting to actually drive systemic change as well. Because in a way, I do think systems change has gotten a bit to and this is a good thing, it's gotten a bit of interest and people wanting to deliver system change, but struggling to know how to do that. So when you've got businesses that trust you and farmers that trust you and know that you're kind of delivering on systemic goals while centering justice and regeneration, it helps build that legitimacy. But to that point I made earlier, it takes time to do that. And so spending the time and building a one-to-one relationship is really important.
Thank you, Valentina. There are a few more questions. One from Leonard, who also was our speaker at one point. He asked, how helpful was the MLP model and what were its limitations, and did you use and explain in your communication with stakeholders?
Yeah, it was actually very helpful because I think a lot of people crave, where did you get this from, right? So like having a structure that people can follow along through a whole process, i.e. I'm not introducing several different models. I'm sticking with one through the whole process that they only, and this is to someone who's a novice, right? Who might not know a lot of system change tools. Having one tool that kind of goes and has a thread throughout the approach was really helpful. And obviously it has helped us because you can use it in so many different ways. We were able to map the barriers, and that gave something to anchor the barriers to, rather than just being a whole random list of barriers. And it also gave an opportunity for the leverage points to have something to kind of center around, because again, they were like, well, where did you pick these leverage points from? I don't see how this is a, exhaustive list. So it gives people something to kind of hold on to when it can be really messy, this kind of systems change work. But one of the limitations is of course, it requires you to spend the time to explain it, right? And when we're talking about how limited people's time is, how do you do that in a way that's not like, here's a half an hour lecture and people are like, well, why the hell, why am I here? And you have to kind of remind people through it as well, in a way where so that's one of the limitations as well, is kind of how do you communicate a tool. And then finally, I would say it's useful insofar as the limitations of it as a tool, right? So it doesn't help us in actually deciding which one to go for, like which leverage point to decide. So we then had to take another approach from going from this point to that point. But we knew that and we kind of planned it in, so it had a kind of shelf life. And then we needed to move on to the next one. But yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay. Leonard, would you like to know more? I will just move on to another question. How do we ensure safety during the change of most vulnerable groups?
How do we ensure safety of the most vulnerable groups?
Yeah, during the change of the most vulnerable groups.
Yeah, so we definitely, through the workshops especially, we take the time to do that process of kind of careful setting the scene of what these sessions are. And we also set up community rules, like guidelines, and how we expect people to show up to these sessions. And we always say that up front, at the front of every workshop, we kind of set up our community guidelines. We even sometimes, when we've got more time, ask people to add to the community guidelines. How else do you want to kind of bravely show up for yourself and create a space that people feel kind of safe in? And to be honest, we actually moved away from using the term a safe space to actually a brave space. Because if we always, and we spoke a lot about this, is that if we always only centered safety, it can also be to the benefit, say, of, in the worst case, the oppressor, but also sometimes people need to feel uncomfortable for some hard truths that need to be heard. But they need to feel that it's a space that they can listen and they won't be attacked. But it's a space where they can kind of feel brave and uncomfortable. But obviously it goes without saying that this isn't, we don't tolerate any kind of offensive language or anything like that. But we're saying the deep work of system change requires hard truths. and confrontations of power and what it means to have power and power over other people. And we create the kind of context for the sessions to have the opportunity for people to come, feel brave, and to share and feel, just to some extent, uncomfortable as well. I hope I made that clear, but we definitely kind of ensure that, just one final point is in particularly vulnerable communities, we definitely have conversations with them, say before a big workshop, and make sure that they feel heard, and that any concerns that they have coming into maybe a big workshop setting where some stuff might come up, that we've had those conversations. We don't want anyone ever to kind of come in cold, so to speak, to those sessions. So we do the kind of pre-work before as well.
Valentina, here are a few more questions from the participants. You could choose any question you would like to answer.
Oh, sorry.
On that thing.
There we go. Sorry, my eyesight's so bad. Thank you, Anya, for zooming in. Different. Okay. Yeah, to the question, sorry, and there's so many great questions. To the if the project is open and you do not tell people what to do, how do you keep both sponsors and followers happy? Is there sometimes conflict? So again, this is also about setting up expectations up front. So definitely obviously we seek funding from funders who understand the work that we're trying to do and understand that sometimes we can't be, 100% clear cut on exactly what output will be delivered 3 years from now. And that kind of process is emergent. So we put in the time and have a kind of network of funders that know us and know what this work entails. So there's definitely that piece about setting the kind of expectations up front. And again, we also set that up front, that this work is open. And so it's a really fine line between allowing people to actually feel excited about an open space, that they can come in and be like, oh, wow, something that I say could actually really influence the direction of this program. It really empowers a lot of people to participate, because they see that they're not just coming as a token. They're not coming as, they might as well not even be in the room, that they come in and that they feel like, oh, wow, something I say and a contribution that I make can really deliver that. And we constantly emphasize that, like, this work is only as strong as the people who participate in it, and as strong as your participation or your contributions. Like, this work is led by you. And that kind of helps with that expectation management. And yeah, so it's trust, it's being really clear up front, and continuously kind of saying, like, the work that is supposed to be coming, this is what the structure will look like, but what the outcomes and the outputs will be co-created with the group. And that often kind of helps with expectations. What else do we have? How different is the value proposition when we're talking to funders versus customers? Well, one point, so we don't necessarily have customers. So this is very much more of a kind of business to business work, right? So it's not necessarily, the work itself isn't necessarily kind of customer focused. And that's not to say that it's not public, right? Like, we're a nonprofit, so we actually have a fiduciary a charity duty to publish everything that we do. So you guys can actually find all this information on our website. But in terms of kind of the value is actually very similar. So we the funders are interested in deep long-term work. that kind of drives systemic change, and also and so are the kind of participants that come in. But I suppose one of the key differences is asking folks to sign up for a 3-year project is harder than asking a funder to fund 3-year projects almost, right? Because people's time is really limited, and you know, that's a long time basically. Although interestingly, we have had people who have participated since the beginning. So we also leave it quite open that it might not be, say, if you're representing your organization, it might be 2 of you in the organization, or you could pass it on to someone else, and that kind of open tent piece as well is kind of part of what happens when you have these long-term programs of work. Which one should I take? Azra, do you have any preference?
I really like this, how to decide how much time to spend on an intervention. The third sticky.
Yeah. And by intervention, do you guys mean like work stream, like the area of work, I suppose?
I know Everbright wrote this.
Yeah, I think I meant, yeah, exactly that work stream, particular work stream.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting question. And this is actually something, so 2 things. We're confronting this right now when we talk about like systems change work is long-term work, right? Like, and especially regenerative agriculture and its outcomes are also kind of long-term work. Like one growing season isn't, right, like what we're seeking out necessarily, like that we won't see those outcomes in, say, soil carbon in necessarily one growing season. So again, this work is long-term work, and how are we also setting up programs of work or getting funding for long-term work? There's actually some really interesting stuff on the kind of landscape level restoration and projects. Organizations like Common Land are really focused on a whole landscape level restoration, which I find really interesting. And they're looking at a 25-year timeline, so really kind of macro. But I think there's a sweet spot that I don't feel necessarily the food system might have kind of got to in the UK, at least, is are there some projects that are looking beyond, say, 3 years, but less than 25, right? Like, what's that midpoint, and how do you, get kind of funding for that? It would require probably cycles of funding through the years, but that in itself takes a lot of time and a lot of dedication to kind of keep getting consistent funding and to keep delivering on it. And then, so that's one point, that kind of difference between landscape, long-term change, and what are different models that look to deliver that. And then I think for us, like all our work streams are almost on like different timelines, because actually the work streams, again, aren't following like a copy paste model of you're going to do this and then you're going to do that and then we're going to do this and it's all going to wrap up in 6 months, right? Like some of them are quicker, snappier, say like action sprint, like really quick succession of workshops and then a quick output. Some are like longer term and might start with its own kind of initial scoping diagnosis and then maybe go into a kind of implementation. Our financing the transition in the US is a cotton pilot. So that's got cotton in the ground, right, for 1 year, and buyers for this year for the carbon. So all of them have really different kind of ways that they're kind of playing out. But we're finding that we had the funding to kind of set up those initial work streams, and now we're seeking funding for almost the work streams as individuals, obviously as part of the Growing Our Future initiative, but we're seeking kind of funding for each individual work stream. And sometimes that can be easier because they're obviously a bit more targeted, and and it might align with an organization's kind of priorities, funders' priorities. But yeah, so the work streams kind of vary in how they're delivered. And I agree that they do need longer term funding, and that in itself takes time as well.
Okay.
Thank you, Valentina. Really answers to what I'd asked. So sorry I hope I'm audible.
Please.
Yeah.
I can hear you.
I asked that because again, sometimes a lot of these professionals are shifting from project to project, right? So the moment you have your team shift, you're losing a lot of motivation, and a lot of other things, and you have to reorient all the new people coming in all the time. So yeah, I was curious about that.
No,
that really answers my question. Thank you.
No, that's great. And that's such a good point to raise. And we have actually found this as well. And it can be really disheartening and frustrating because, you created a really great relationship with a retailer, for example, and then they leave and then you have to start again. So I think there's really something about investing and asking for there to be kind of more than one touch point in an organization than just that single person, because we have wasted, as you suggested, like a lot of time because we had to rebuild an entire relationship with an organization that was kind of involved. So, one of the things that we've looked at is really like, how can we make sure that there's more than one contact that we've got a kind of solid relationship with for continuity's sake. Cool. What else?
I think we have time for just one more question, or maybe we can just fudge two more.
Let's see. So maybe that first one. Yeah, I think one really quick example of some resistance that we found on the US side was actually with when we were articulating the goals of the US food system, so the regenerative agriculture food system, that to and from the current to the to, we had some resistance. We took the kind of final copy of the framings and the words that we were using out to some participants, and we had not a lot of pushback, but there were some organizations that pushed back on our use of like systemic white supremacy as being part and parcel of the current US food system. So that led to some really interesting conversations about, where are our lines? What are we willing to kind of compromise on? Are those organizations, because, they were coming from the position like, we can't be affiliated with something that says, that the current food system is inherently founded on, white supremacy injustices. So, which we also understand. So that led to a really interesting kind of conversation of how do we move forward with that. And there were some participants who insisted that language was in there, right? And that was, their experience. So that's kind of some of the things that we've had to navigate as well. What are some other questions? Do we have time for one more, Anya, or do you want to wrap up?
Oh, we have time for one more.
One more. Techniques to get players on board and see the system they're part of. Yeah. We definitely use a lot of kind of painting. So this is where our futures tools come in, right? And kind of being able to paint that picture and the kind of storytelling aspects component. And we also had folks share their experiences and their, versions of their stories on our workshops as well, so that we were hearing from folks. We would ask, we would have, because this was during COVID, we were doing this, so there were a lot of online gatherings. We would have people, we would do these kind of round robins, like really quick rounds of breakout groups, and people were kind of getting to know each other. And in those cases, we were asking people to tell their own stories. So rather than us kind of doing, again, like holding a kind of our truth or whatever, our version of a story, we were putting up situations where how can we get participants to share their own stories to each other, rather than us standing here and saying like, here is a story, for example. So again, it was that, notion of like, how are we building a participatory, co-creative kind of storytelling where there are multiple versions of the food system that we're kind of working towards. And that was really good for folks who like weren't used to, it builds like unlikely allyships, basically, where you don't realize that like someone who is seemingly very different from you has a very similar experience, or is working towards the same goals that you are. And that builds that kind of collective trust. And you start to build a we in this movement, right? Because we had to kind of build an us. And actually, sorry, Anya, one more point. One of the things that we did was we used this kind of nested tool to help us kind of frame some questions, which was we would take participants from thinking about the me. So we'd ask them like, what is my role and what can I do and what's in my sphere of control, to then thinking about us as a collective, then again starting to build that kind of idea of the participants as us, and we're in this together, and starting to build that trust, and then kind of as a wider food movement within the kind of the next nest was kind of a wider food movement. So again, like building in these moments for us to not always hold the narrative, have other people share their stories, and also build a kind of sense of a collective, that we're kind of in this together, despite what might originally, or at the start, feel like very different positions that people are coming from. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you so much, Valentina, and also thanks everyone for all of these amazing questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to answer the last one, but there's but there's definitely space to answer and actually ask this question in the Food Hub space itself. So wrapping up now, since we've just got 1 minute left. I hope that you all really enjoyed this speaker case study, and also thank you, Valentina, for spending time to really share your experience with everyone. And is it okay for people to ask you outside?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's my LinkedIn linked on the Miro board. So yeah, absolutely, feel free.
So thanks, Valentina, also for that opportunity. And also, I hope that this session was really useful for everyone. And feel free to also link up to our Food Hub LinkedIn, as well as the SI network. We have a Food Hub space on the SI network. And this Miro board will also just be available for everyone who wants to use these links. Also here to Forum for the Future, and this is the link to the project Growing Our Future, so you can also paste any resources you would like to share in this space as well. And I might also add that the Food Hub will also launch a co-creation event in January, and here is the link to see more information about that. And we would be very glad if you could also paste your feedback here or write any comments about the session if you want us to address a next topic, or host an event around a certain question as well. That's possible. Just feel free to grab a sticker here and paste your comments and any feedback. And then I'm wrapping up now. And thank you again, Valentina, for joining. And also thanks everyone for listening and being a great audience. And thanks for the Food Hub for being good hosts of this space. And Joss is here as well. Hi, Joss. And yes, thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, Valentina.